It started on a gray Sunday morning. Mom called the night before saying she wanted to talk about the future. When I arrived, the house smelled like brewed coffee and tension. Dad sat at the dining table, papers spread neatly before him. Mom gestured for me to sit. Her smile was polite, but her hands were shaking slightly. Without looking at me, Dad said, "We've updated the will. It's just practical." Mom slid a folder across the table. I opened it, expecting numbers, not betrayal. My name wasn't there anymore. Every property, every share, even Grandma's necklace, all transferred to my brother Daniel. He was standing by the window pretending not to listen, but the small curl at his lips said everything. "You're successful, Evelyn," Mom added softly. "You don't need our help." For a moment, no one spoke. The clock ticked loud enough to hurt. I nodded, because that's what good daughters do, make it easy for everyone else. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp and clean, the kind that makes you feel awake in the worst way. I sat in my car, staring at the gate, the one I painted when I was 17, as it closed behind me. That's when I realized they hadn't just written me out of their will, they'd written me out of us. And that quiet, shattering moment became a promise. They can keep their money. I'll build something they'll never be able to buy back. If you've ever been the one left out, the one your family chose to forget, then you'll understand what came next, because that day wasn't my ending. It was the beginning of a story I never thought I'd tell. So stay with me. There's more to this family story than they ever expected. I wish I could tell you that morning was just a misunderstanding, that someone made a mistake and they'd call me later to fix it. But days passed, then weeks, and the silence became its own kind of message. When I finally called, Mom's tone was light, like nothing had happened. "You've always been so good with money, honey. Daniel's not like you. He still needs guidance. That was the word she used when he maxed out their credit card in college. It was the word she used when he crashed Dad's truck and blamed the fog. I should have been used to it by now. The pattern, the forgiveness, the excuses. But this time, it wasn't about mistakes. It was about trust. And they'd just proven who they trusted more. Daniel had always been the golden child, charming, careless, and gifted at turning every failure into someone else's fault. He could walk into a room, say 3 words, and people would laugh like he'd done something clever. Dad adored him for it, said he had the kind of confidence you can't teach. Meanwhile, I was the one who balanced the books, who helped pay for Dad's surgery when insurance fell short, but my victories never made noise. They didn't sparkle the way Daniel's did. I remember one night years ago after I got promoted at the firm. I came home with a small bottle of champagne, excited to share the news. Dad had the TV on, watching Daniel's interview about his startup. It wasn't really his. It was a project I'd helped him design, financed quietly with my own savings when he begged for a chance. And now he was sitting there on screen, taking full credit. Dad raised his glass and said, "That's my boy." I never told him the truth. I just smiled. Maybe that's where I went wrong, letting silence protect them from their own reflection. After the will, Daniel called me once. His voice was casual, too casual. "No hard feelings, Ev. It's just paperwork. Dad said it makes things simpler." Simpler. That word again, as if erasing me was a matter of convenience. But there was something else in his tone that I couldn't quite place. A flicker of triumph, and maybe fear, because Daniel was never good at hiding when he was lying. A few days later, a client of mine, someone who worked in real estate, mentioned that my family's vineyard had quietly been reappraised. "Strange timing," he said. "Usually people do that before a sale, not after." Something in me froze. I checked the public filings. Sure enough, the property had been transferred not just to Daniel, but into a new holding company, and the person listed as secondary signatory was my father. That's when I realized the truth. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was business. Dad wasn't giving Daniel a head start. They were planning something together. And Mom, the woman who'd always said, "I just want peace in this family," had stayed quiet through it all. I drove to their house that night. The lights were still on. I could see their silhouettes through the living room window, Dad with his drink, Daniel on his phone, Mom pretending not to hear the laughter that didn't include me. I almost rang the bell. Almost. But I stopped myself. What would I say? That I'd finally figured out they'd been building a life without me? That the daughter who once saved them from losing everything had become an inconvenience they'd rather erase? Instead, I sat in my car, just like I did the day they showed me that folder, and whispered into the dark, "All right then. You've made your choice. Now watch what I do with mine. When I pulled away, I didn't know where I was heading, only that I couldn't go back. The house, the vineyard, the inheritance, none of it mattered anymore. But the truth did, and that's where the second betrayal began. Not theirs against me, but mine against their expectations. Because while they built their empire on greed and illusion, I was about to build something real. One choice, one risk, one quiet storm at a time. At first I thought revenge would come quickly, that I'd work harder, earn more, and that somehow the world would notice. But that's not how life works. The first few months after the will felt like moving through fog. I'd wake up early, pour my coffee, and stare at the same numbers on my spreadsheets without seeing them. It wasn't anger that kept me going. It was something colder. The quiet determination of someone who's finally out of reasons to wait. So, I started small. A consulting job for a struggling bakery owner who'd just lost her accountant. Then another client, a retired couple trying to keep their motel from bankruptcy. I didn't make much at first, but every late night, every solved problem, every thank you felt like a brick in something I was finally building for myself. Within 2 years, my name started to mean something again. Not in my family, but in my field. By the 3rd year, I had my own small firm. 7 employees, 40 clients, a reputation for being the one you called when you were about to lose everything. It wasn't a fortune yet, but it was mine. Every cent of it. Then one evening I got an unexpected email. Subject: Vineyard valuation. Urgent. It was from an old colleague in finance, someone who used to handle property trusts. He wrote, "Thought you'd want to know. Your family's vineyard was sold last week, but the funds didn't go where they should have. I froze. I hadn't checked on that property in years. It was supposed to be tied up under Daniel's name now, part of the estate." I called him that night. He didn't answer. Instead, the next morning, I got a text. "Don't worry about things that aren't yours anymore." It hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the words, but because I could hear Dad's voice in them. A week later, I got a call from Mom. She sounded nervous, like she was choosing every word carefully. "Your father's been tired lately," she said. "Daniel's been helping with the accounts." Something in me tightened. Dad had always handled his own business. He didn't let anyone touch the finances, not even Mom. I drove to their house the next day. The air felt heavy before I even rang the bell. Mom opened the door, surprised but not unhappy to see me. Inside, the once proud living room was cluttered with unopened mail, empty glasses, and the faint smell of medication. Dad was in his chair, thinner, paler. When he looked at me, there was a flicker of recognition and guilt. "Evelyn," he said slowly, "you shouldn't have come." I knelt beside him. "Dad, what's going on? Why are there unpaid bills here? Where's Daniel?" He hesitated, then sighed. He said he'd take care of everything. Those words chilled me. I asked to see the bank statements. Mom hesitated, then handed me a folder from the counter. Half the pages were missing. The accounts that once held their retirement savings were nearly empty, and in their place, transfer slips to a new company, Hartson Estates LLC, Daniel's company. That was the moment I understood. The real betrayal wasn't just theirs against me. It was Daniel's against them. He hadn't just taken my inheritance, he'd taken theirs too. By the time I left that house, Dad had fallen asleep, and Mom stood by the window staring out like she'd known for weeks, but couldn't bring herself to speak. Outside, the air was cold and quiet. I called my attorney before I even reached my car. We pulled the records the next morning, and what we found was worse than I'd imagined. Daniel had used my father's power of attorney to move nearly everything into his own holdings. He'd mortgaged the vineyard twice, drained the accounts, and used the family name to secure private loans. He wasn't saving the estate, he was gutting it. And the cruelest part? Dad had signed most of it willingly, convinced his favorite son would take care of everything. For a long moment, I just stared at the files. The digital paper trail of trust turned poison. Then I remembered my father's words the day I was cut out. It's practical. Practical. That's what he called betrayal dressed as logic. I didn't cry this time. I didn't even feel pity. I just knew that the person they'd underestimated, the daughter they dismissed as too independent, was now the only one who could fix what was left. I closed my laptop and whispered to myself, "Fine, Daniel. You wanted the empire? Let's see if you can survive the truth." That night, I began gathering evidence. Every transaction, every false signature, every stolen dollar. Because this time, I wasn't coming back for what was mine. I was coming back for justice. The morning I decided to confront them, the city was wrapped in fog. Thick, stubborn, the kind that refuses to lift until you face it. It felt fitting. For weeks, I'd gathered everything, the falsified transfers, the missing loan records, the digital signatures that didn't match. Each file was another piece of the truth, and together they painted a portrait I wished wasn't real. Daniel hadn't just betrayed our family. He'd built an empire of lies on top of their trust. And Dad, he'd been too proud to see it. I drove to the house without calling ahead. When Mom opened the door, her eyes widened, not with surprise, but dread. "Evelyn," she whispered, "please, not today." "Today's exactly the day," I said quietly. Inside, the air was heavy. Dad sat in his armchair, his cane resting beside him. Daniel stood near the fireplace, his sleeves rolled up, looking far too relaxed for a man with that much to hide. "If this is another lecture about the will," he said, "save it." "We're all tired." I placed a folder on the coffee table. The sound of paper hitting wood echoed like a gunshot. "Then let's talk about what you've done since," I said. Dad frowned. "What's this?" "Your signature," I replied, sliding the first document toward him. "And this one. And this one. Do you remember signing these, Dad?" He leaned forward, squinting. "Of course." Daniel said they were refinancing documents. I looked straight at my brother. They weren't. They were transfers. Every cent you owned went straight to his company. "You didn't refinance. You surrendered." Daniel's smirk faltered. "You're mistaken." "I'm not," I said. "I traced every transaction. I have the wire logs, timestamps, and even the forged authorization forms. You didn't just cheat me, Daniel. You robbed your own father." For a moment, no one moved. Then Dad's voice, quiet and trembling. "Daniel, tell me she's wrong." Daniel laughed softly, a hollow sound. "You think she knows more about business than me? She's twisting everything to make me look bad." Mom's hands were trembling. "Stop it, both of you," she said. "We can fix this." But there was nothing left to fix. I pulled out the final sheet, a sale record for the vineyard, signed under Daniel's name, dated 2 months ago. "You didn't even keep it," I said. "You sold it to cover your debts." Dad's face went pale. "Debts?" Daniel said nothing. The silence was his confession. The argument that followed didn't sound like family anymore. It sounded like strangers breaking the last pieces of what once held them together. Dad shouted first, something about betrayal, honor, shame. Mom tried to stop him, but he pushed her hand away. Daniel turned to me, eyes burning. "You wanted this, didn't you? To see me fail? To watch Dad hate me?" I stood still. "No, I wanted to see you tell the truth." He stepped closer, his voice low, sharp. "You think you're better than us just because you built your own little business? You wouldn't even have a degree if Dad hadn't paid for it." I took a breath. "And you wouldn't have a conscience if I'd let you borrow mine." His hand twitched, a flash of something cruel behind his eyes, but Dad's voice cut through before it could turn uglier. "Get out," he said hoarsely. At first, Daniel thought he was talking to me, but then Dad rose slowly, gripping the cane like a gavel. "You. Get out of this house. You've stolen enough." Daniel froze. He looked at Mom, but she turned away. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw fear instead of arrogance. He left without a word. When the door finally closed, Dad sank back into his chair. He looked smaller, older, like the weight of truth had aged him in seconds. Mom sat beside him, crying quietly. "I didn't want to believe it," she whispered. "I thought keeping peace was better than taking sides." I nodded slowly. Sometimes silence is the loudest betrayal of all. Dad reached for my hand, the same one he hadn't held since I was a little girl. "I was wrong about you, Evelyn. You didn't need us. We needed you." I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the fog had started to lift. Light fell through the windows, touching the old photographs on the wall, pictures of happier times, of promises made and forgotten. I looked at them and thought of all the things that money could destroy and the few it couldn't. That night, as I drove home, I didn't feel triumphant, just steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing their approval or running from their rejection. I was simply walking my own road, one built from the pieces they left behind. And somewhere deep down, I knew the story wasn't over yet, because Daniel's silence never lasted long, and neither did guilt. It had been 6 months since that day, since the shouting, the silence, and the door that closed behind Daniel like a final chapter. Life had gone strangely calm after the storm. Dad sold what was left of the property, settling debts Daniel left behind. Mom started visiting me on weekends, bringing old photo albums like olive branches. For the first time, our conversations didn't feel like transactions. They felt like healing. My business had grown too, steady, clean, quiet growth. There was something poetic about it. While my brother's empire had crumbled, mine had taken root in honesty. But peace never lasts long when greed still breathes somewhere. One evening, just as I was leaving the office, I saw him, Daniel, standing by my car under the dim light of the parking lot. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. "You look good," he said with a strained smile. "Success suits you." I didn't answer. I unlocked my car but didn't get in. "What do you want?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I made mistakes." "I know that, but things got out of hand. The investors turned on me. Dad froze the accounts. I just need a little help, Eve. A loan, maybe. Something to get back on my feet." The sound of Eve from his mouth made something twist inside me. A word that used to mean closeness now felt like manipulation. "You mean you want me to fix the mess you made?" I said quietly. He looked down, avoiding my eyes. "You always knew how to fix things. You're good at it. I'm not." There was a part of me, the part that remembered growing up with him, the brother who once shared secrets and late-night snacks, that wanted to believe him. But the rest of me remembered bank records, forged signatures, and the way he smirked while cutting me out of my own family. I took a breath. "And you wouldn't have a conscience if I'd let you borrow mine." His hand twitched, a flash of something cruel behind his eyes, but Dad's voice cut through before it could turn uglier. "Get out," he said hoarsely. At first, Daniel thought he was talking to me, but then Dad rose slowly, gripping the cane like a gavel. "You. Get out of this house. You've stolen enough." Daniel froze. He looked at Mom, but she turned away. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw fear instead of arrogance. He left without a word. When the door finally closed, Dad sank back into his chair. He looked smaller, older, like the weight of truth had aged him in seconds. Mom sat beside him crying quietly. "I didn't want to believe it," she whispered. "I thought keeping peace was better than taking sides." I nodded slowly. Sometimes silence is the loudest betrayal of all. Dad reached for my hand, the same one he hadn't held since I was a little girl. "I was wrong about you, Evelyn. You didn't need us. We needed you." I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the fog had started to lift. Light fell through the windows, touching the old photographs on the wall, pictures of happier times, of promises made and forgotten. I looked at them and thought of all the things that money could destroy, and the few it couldn't. That night, as I drove home, I didn't feel triumphant, just steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing their approval or running from their rejection. I was simply walking my own road, one built from the pieces they left behind. And somewhere deep down, I knew. The story wasn't over yet, because Daniel's silence never lasted long. And neither did guilt. It had been 6 months since that day, since the shouting, the silence, and the door that closed behind Daniel like a final chapter. Life had gone strangely calm after the storm. Dad sold what was left of the property, settling debts Daniel left behind. Mom started visiting me on weekends, bringing old photo albums like olive branches. For the first time, our conversations didn't feel like transactions. They felt like healing. My business had grown too, steady, clean, quiet growth. There was something poetic about it. While my brother's empire had crumbled, mine had taken root in honesty. But peace never lasts long when greed still breathes somewhere. One evening, just as I was leaving the office, I saw him. Daniel, standing by my car under the dim light of the parking lot. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. "You look good," he said with a strained smile. "Success suits you." I didn't answer. I unlocked my car but didn't get in. "What do you want?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I made mistakes." "I know that. But things got out of hand. The investors turned on me. Dad froze the accounts. I just need a little help, Eve. A loan, maybe. Something to get back on my feet." The sound of Eve from his mouth made something twist inside me. A word that used to mean closeness now felt like manipulation. "You mean you want me to fix the mess you made?" I said quietly. He looked down, avoiding my eyes. "You always knew how to fix things. You're good at it." "I'm not." There was a part of me, the part that remembered growing up with him, the brother who once shared secrets and late-night snacks, that wanted to believe him. But the rest of me remembered bank records, forged signatures, and the way he smirked while cutting me out of my own family. "You didn't come here for help, Daniel," I said softly. "You came because everyone else stopped believing your story." He flinched like I'd hit him. "You don't have to do this. We're family. You should have thought of that before you sold it for profit." He tried again, voice cracking this time. "Please, Eve. I have nothing left." The honesty in his tone startled me. For the first time, he sounded human. Not smug, not confident, just broken. I studied his face. He looked like a reflection of everything money couldn't save: pride, fear, and regret. But pity is a dangerous thing when it's mistaken for forgiveness. I opened my purse, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to him. He took it eagerly, thinking it was cash, but when he opened it, his expression fell. Inside was a copy of the legal notice I'd filed the week before: Hartson Estates, LLC, formally dissolved, pending fraud restitution. "You'll get your second chance," I said, "but not the one you expected." His eyes widened. You turned it over to the state?" "I turned it over to justice," I replied, "and you can call it whatever helps you sleep." He stared at me, jaw tight, hands trembling slightly. Then he said something so small, I almost missed it. "You were always stronger than me." I didn't know if it was a confession or an accusation, maybe both. When he left, the night air felt lighter. I sat in my car, watching his figure fade into the dark. There was no victory in it, no triumph, no revenge, just the quiet understanding that sometimes winning isn't about who ends up with more. It's about who finally stops needing to prove anything at all. The next morning, I got a call from Mom. She didn't ask about Daniel. She just said Dad was proud of me, that he wanted to meet for lunch. No business talk, just family. For once, I said yes, without hesitation. As I hung up, sunlight spilled through my office window, glinting off the framed photo of my first client, the bakery owner who'd trusted me when no one else did. I smiled, because somehow in rebuilding others' lives, I'd rebuilt my own. The fortune they couldn't deny wasn't money, it was peace, and I'd earned every bit of it. When I went back to my parents' house, spring was beginning to bloom. The vines were gone, the soil bare, but the hills still glowed gold under the setting sun. It looked nothing like the home I remembered, and yet, somehow, it felt gentler. Dad was sitting on the porch, his blanket pulled tight across his knees. He looked smaller now, quieter, like the years had finally caught up with him. When he saw me, he smiled, that rare, unguarded kind of smile I'd waited my whole life to see. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure I should," I replied. "You should. Some doors only open when you stop trying to force them." We sat together for a while saying nothing. The silence didn't sting anymore. It just settled between us, calm and honest. Mom joined us with 2 cups of tea. She looked tired, but there was a peace in her face I hadn't seen in years. "You were right," she said quietly. "We thought giving Daniel everything would make things easier. But it only showed us who truly understood what family means. I didn't need to answer. The truth already lived in the quiet." Dad reached into his pocket, pulling out a small brass key, the one that used to open every door in that old house. He placed it in my hand. "It doesn't unlock anything now," he said. "But maybe it reminds you that not all doors are meant to close forever." I held the key and felt its warmth. It was more than a symbol of forgiveness. It was an ending that finally felt fair. When I left, the air was still, soft with the scent of earth and rain. The gate at the end of the driveway stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. Once, that gate had closed behind me with rejection. Now it waited, patient, welcoming, free. I ran my fingers along its edge and whispered, "They thought cutting me out of their will would erase me." But all it did was remind me how much I could build on my own. If you've ever been the one left out, the one who had to start again from nothing, I hope this story finds you. Because your worth isn't written in anyone's will. It's written in the choices you make when no one believes in you. And if stories like this one speak to you, stories of loss, strength, and the quiet kind of victory, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Sometimes a single story can remind us that no matter who shuts the door, we still have the power to build our own.